Hey everyone, I'm Stephanie, and I believe that all readers should read children's literature, especially adults. So that's what we do on the Kid Lit Love podcast. We celebrate all things children's literature, picture books, early readers, middle grade, and young adult novels too. Whether you're an adult reading to your inner child or connecting the young readers in your lives with fantastic books, you've come to the right place. Each week, we'll talk to a different children's literature author and discuss their books, their hopes and dreams for readers, their writing process, and much, much more. So, grab a notebook to build your TBR, and let's get to today's episode of Kid Lit Love. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Kid Lit Love podcast. I'm Stephanie, your Kid Lit Loving host, inviting you to another weekly conversation with a children's literature author. Today, I am thrilled to be talking with James Ponti, the New York Times bestselling author of multiple middle grade series. Series like City Spies, Framed, the Dead City Trilogy, and his newest that I'll be talking with us today about, the Sherlock Society. He's the founder of a writers group called the Renegades of Middle Grade, and, oh, by the way, is also an Emmy-nominated television writer and producer. He's here today to talk about the newest book in his Sherlock Society series. This book is full of friends and family and action and adventure, and it is the perfect book for right now. James, welcome to the Kid Lit Love podcast. I'm so glad you're here today.
I am thrilled to be here. This is my favorite thing to talk about is Kid Lit.
Me too. And the pleasure really is all mine though, because I am coming to you as a big City Spies fan.
Oh.
But I've got to say, the Sherlock Society might have they're neck and neck. I adored this book. I loved it, and I can't wait to talk about it with you.
Absolutely loved writing it. It is I love all the things I get to write. I mean, it's so much fun, but um after all the jet setting of City Spies, which will continue on. So half of my year is jet setting around the world, and then the other half is a little more centered and focused now, writing about the Sherlock Society down in South Florida, which is closer to home. And it's a nice back and forth for me to get to switch. There's some similarities, but I think they go together well, but they're still different. And so that helps me creatively and everything else wise.
Well, I would love to jump on that because you do have multiple middle grade novels that are big fan favorites. You clearly write a lot and have a lot of kids who adore your series. So I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about you and how you got here. What's the backstory of how you have these four amazing series that we all love?
Well, it's weird because sometimes I look and I say, how did I get here? And I'm not exactly sure because there was no great path and plan, even though I try to think about my career as I was going on. But I always wanted to be a writer. I knew that in elementary school. I have never once wanted to be anything but a writer. And the question was always, what would I write? I was a what do they call it? Not a difficult reader. I was a reluctant reader when I was growing up. Very reluctant. They didn't have that term then. They just said I was a boy, and they said boys don't read and whatever.
Right.
And I read only one or two books that I can remember growing up. Um, but I love movies and television. I really love them because unlike books, which my problem with reading was always just that I was slower at it than my friends, and I would never finish the book, and it would just frustrate me. So movies were great because movies or TV show were the same length for everyone, and at the end we could talk about it, and I really got into it. And so when I went to college, I majored in screenwriting, and my career started off as a kids television writer. So I wrote at Disney Channel, I wrote at Nickelodeon, I wrote for PBS and other animated stuff, and I was in that realm very happily for about 10 years. And then one day, or maybe even longer than 10 years, but as I got close to 40, all of a sudden they stopped wanting us to write kids TV. And so my friends and I, who were that age, we better find something else. And for a while, I became a television producer, which sounds much more impressive than it was. Not like a big shot with like fancy cars and assistants, but more like on cable channels, I would make documentaries and I would get a crew and we'd fly across the country or sometimes to Europe or something, and we'd make a show about something. And it was a really great exercise and I really liked it and it fit all the film stuff that I loved, but it got less and less writing. And I've still always viewed myself and consider myself first, foremost, and always a writer. And so I decided to maybe I could write books on the side. And so for a while, the first 7 books I wrote at night and on the weekend while I was doing this television production stuff. And then I finally made the jump, aided by COVID, to, maybe I can just do books because I found out as much as I loved all the other things, I didn't love any writing as much as writing kids' books. And my fear though was that, gee, without that income, maybe I need something else. So I decided to write 2 book series a year, which now sometimes I regret because it's like I having trouble keeping up, but then sometimes I love because every 6 months it's a new book and it's a new start.
Right.
And it's chances like this to talk about a new group of characters and kids that I just adore writing.
Yeah. Well, I can see the background of your television experience because reading this felt like watching an action slash adventure because it just felt so immersive. I was there with you in Florida. I was in the Everglades. I was with the kids. I was, smiling at grandpa. So it is just such an immersive book that readers will just not be able to help themselves from falling into.
Well, it's a funny thing. There are a number of kid writers. Um, talk about like Stu Gibbs or Suzanne Collins or Victoria Aveyard. That's kind of all over the place. But I could list probably 20 kidlit writers who, in fact, started as script writers.
Yeah.
And it is, I think, a real phenomenon right now in middle grade specifically of people with a film and television background who bring that perspective to their books. And I think some people might think, oh, that's a bad thing. I don't mean it in a way that they're dumbing down the books, but the books are plotted at a pace as film and television are.
Mhm.
And I think that that would have helped me as a reader. I think that's why I do it. That would have helped me as a reader. But even in other weird ways, going to which I can't turn off that part of my brain. So, for example, in this new book opens up with a rescue in Biscayne Bay by the Marine Patrol, Miami Police Department. So I called the Marine Patrol up and they took me out in a boat and we raced around Biscayne Bay like and I asked them about real rescues and stuff. But I wasn't just researching, I was scouting. I'm like, okay, if I had a camera, which is what I normally would do when I would scout a documentary, I'd put one on the boat. I'd get that. Oh, that background looks great. Oh, that's evocative. And I really scout almost as though I'm scouting still for a documentary or a TV show for these books. And, I did it in City Spies. I went to the train station in Edinburgh and I thought, well, where should other than just saying it's in a train station, it's like, what's the most dynamic looking part of the train station? And how can that help me write it and make it more come to life?
My mind is just spinning because I never even thought about, as someone who does not have any sort of television or screenwriting experience, I can picture you gathering the information for the book like you would gather something for a show or a documentary, and like, in my head, I'm thinking, "What a cool job you have, James Ponti."
It really is, and maybe it's just maybe I do it only because it's more fun that way. But I'll take 100 pictures at a location, and I just fill my computer screen with it when I'm writing that scene, so I can go back and forth. And the pictures aren't again just to describe, oh, what's the right color green, or what's there's a ramp there and a stairway there. But it triggers memories of, oh, that's right, like the Marine Patrol again. It's like it was a combination between a police station and a dive shop. Their handcuffs and face masks just dangling next to each other. And then you kind of smell the salt and it's like you can hopefully bring it to life. It's always the key. But for Sherlock Society, I drove down there's another writer who's a friend of mine, Christina Diaz Gonzalez, great writer. She wrote Concealed, she wrote the Red Umbrella. She has Invisible is her new graphic novel. That's great. And Christina lives in Miami. And so she was kind of my host. I drove down there and we visited every location from the book and we talked to the people. We got behind the scenes. A federal judge took me to the courthouse. All these things, and then she was there to help me bounce ideas off and to remember off of. And it was just so much fun to immerse myself in the story, to write it, and hopefully that makes it easier for you to immerse yourself in the story when you read it.
Yeah, it did. It did. I was there, and I have to admit that I read it with a device close by because I found myself Googling because I've been to Florida, a couple of times. I've been in the Everglades once to look for alligators at night. Somewhere somebody took me. And I found myself looking up things about Al Capone. Then I found myself looking up things about, okay, what do the Everglades really look like right there? So I found that your words brought it to life in my mind, but then when I paired it with Google to get that real life, I just felt like I was there. It was such an immersive
It
thing.
it's I think that is how a lot of people read, a lot of kids read, and I think, that's a part that I think for teachers that I really aspire to. So my websites have a lot of teacher assist my wife's a teacher, so she insists me create a lot of content for teachers. But in all of them are jumping off points. So, for example, the family in the book, the father is a marine biology professor at the University of Miami. And so I tracked one down, and he actually lived in the neighborhood that I had already fictionally created for the kids. So it was great. So I interviewed his kids about what's it like. And I went with him when he was doing this work with corals. And anything in there, because I thought, how great if someone reads this and the kid says, "Well, what about that?" That the teacher can easily click a couple buttons and bring up his whole project. He's doing a project that is about the warming of the ocean, and he gets coral from warmer climates from like Central America, South America, and he brings it and he crossbreeds it with the colon with the a coral here in Florida to make it more heat resistant. So it's like that's a very real, of the moment, fascinating bit of research that is just a backdrop of the story, but it's something you can get into, and then generates a whole classroom conversation about it, which hopefully is the goal.
Yeah. And as well, I'm still a teacher. I just work with teachers, but as a former teachers of smaller people, I definitely appreciate that, and I did note that on the website, as well as hopefully I'll ask you later, about the renegades of middle grade. You've got a lot of great stuff on that site for teachers, educators, librarians, parents, as well. So I definitely wanna come back to that.
Sure.
But I want to I want to ask you about the story itself because we've teased listeners a bit of where it is and what might be happening and a few little buzzwords, but I'd love for you to tell them just a little bit about the story in your own words to give them a sense of it because not many people have read it yet. It is
Yeah.
coming out quite soon on September 3rd. So I'd love for you to give them a taste of what it's
Sure.
like.
So actually, the pitch came to me, the pitch that came to me is the opening paragraph, which from memory, so I won't get it exactly right, but it was, if our name was Baker, we would have sold cupcakes. If our name was Walker, we would have taken care of people's pets. We're on our vacation. But our name is Sherlock, so detective agency just seemed like the thing to do. And the idea, it's about a brother and sister who decide to open a detective agency along with two friends, and mom quickly shuts that down. But grandpa, who is a central character, that was something new I wanted to do, is I have a grandfather who lives with them, and I wanted a multi-generational story, which really seems appropriate for Florida especially. And the grandpa was an investigative reporter for the Miami Herald, and he has file cabinets filled with unsolved stories that he worked on over his years as a reporter. And so basically, he and the kids go with these files, and it's like a cold case crew, and they get to investigate. And a lot of the mysteries in them are real South Florida mysteries. And that was a great fun way to start, to incorporate that and then throw in fictional stuff. And so it is about their group. But one fun thing about so that's the plot. And the plot is they start off searching for Al Capone's hidden money. A lot of people think of Capone as Chicago because that's where he was most of the time. But actually, before he went to Alcatraz, he'd already moved his operations to Miami, and he buried a lot of money there. He actually, in real life, I think, buried, safe deposit keys, but I just turned it into money to take out a step of it, and when he was in prison, he lost his mind, and he had no memory of where it was hidden. And for all we know, they were never able to find the millions of dollars that were buried. So they start off looking for that, but they stumble onto other new things. And I don't want to spoil any stuff. So
Right.
there's old and cold, but there's also new and pressing. And it's really about the chance to write about the dynamics of these kids solving mysteries, dealing with what it's like to be in middle school, the ups and downs of that, and the influence of this grandfather character who's so much fun to write, who is a little unhinged and delightful and wonderful, and it's hands down everyone's favorite character so far that's read the book, and they talk to me. It's like they could talk about grandpa forever.
Yes.
And that's the idea behind the story.
Yeah, I found as I was reading, I found myself just saying, I need a grandpa. I need someone to just, he's there to encourage and to push and to nudge and to teach. As
Right.
I love the dynamics between grandpa and mom. The
Yes.
other side of the story.
Right. Because grandpa's a little bit, he's not well within all the rules, and mom is an attorney who is very much within the rules. And so, it's a great influence. My mother lived with us in the last like 5 or 6 years of her life, and the role that she played with my kids was not the role that I played with my kids. And it was great for them to have this kind of outlaw component to their relationship with their grandmother.
So let's talk about the kids for a minute because these kids are so real and relatable. They are funny. They are super smart in their own way. They each have some sort of special skill, but they're also snarky and just real kids, like the banter back and forth. I think that's also what made me feel like I was there in the thick of things was this banter between the kids. And they're just these smart, curious, want to know more, let me see what I can come up with kind of kids. And I just loved how what they were curious about, they just leaned into. And of course, grandpa was there to help. But to see how each of the characters kind of came into their own skill set, if you will, they contributed it, and then the teamwork that just came between them. I imagine there are a lot of kids that are going to be able to instantly say, "Oh, I relate to this one. I relate to that one," or see themselves or their friends.
That was the biggest crossover, hopefully, from City Spies. So
Mhm.
City Spies has a group of 5 kids now this far along in the series, actually 6 kids who work together on these spy cases. And when I was developing Sherlock Society, my editor was she said, one of the things that we really think connects readers with City Spies is that there is someone for any reader to identify with.
Yes.
Like it's not just like sometimes you'll have a story about a world that you know nothing about and it's kind of aspirational and interesting. But this is like, well, yeah, I'm not a spy, but I'm like that. And she goes, I really like it. We should really aim for the same thing with this. And that was always my goal. It was to, I wanted a sibling dynamic. So we have a brother and sister, because I think that's an interesting dynamic to write with. Then there is and it's narrated by the younger brother just because I'm the youngest. And so I see the worldview through the youngest, not the oldest. And actually the friends, what was made it I think a fun dynamic is the friends are his friends, not hers.
Yeah.
And I don't want to get too much into plot, but she kind of gets them for so she's of the more popular bend at school, and they're more the opposite. And at first, this is kind of like her sentence of a horrible summer is that she's stuck with the kids who at school she would never spend time with, and then over time they build a real friendship. Um, I think hopefully that banter that you talk about is a byproduct of years of script writing, which is so much dialogue driven because
Mhm.
you don't have the freedom to change around and move around as much. You have fewer sets, fewer locations that you really have to develop dialogue that propels plot without just saying plot. And so and I've always been of the thought that, I'm going to ask you to buy something that's not 100% true, which is kids who solve crimes or kids who go on spy missions. So the least I owe you, if you're willing to give me that, is the relationship between those kids needs to be as true and every day as possible. And so that's really what I aspire to with them, and as I try to develop them, not make them tropes or cliches or stereotypes, but like real kids that I know, or a real kid that I was was friends with,
Yeah. So this book comes out on September 3rd,
right?
and I don't give spoilers on this podcast either, but I will just say at the end, there is something that happens that makes the reader wish that book 2 was out right then. So we can keep going. I was like, "No, I need to know. I need to know where they're going next." So when could we expect the next one, or what are you
So
working
so the pattern that I see that I think is developing, and of course publishing can always tweak a little bit here and there, is that there will be a new City Spies book every February and a new Sherlock Society book every September. Um, so we can't do more than one a year in
on?
a series you know, without losing it completely,
Right.
my grip on reality. But it helps to go back and forth between the two, and hopefully, yeah. So you're gonna have to wait a year. I'm still writing it, so I don't even know what happens next. I have ideas, but I haven't solidified what happens next. Although I realize we take this out of order. By the time this comes out, I will have finished it. Uh, should I take that back, or I'm sorry?
That's okay. That's okay.
Okay. All right. Yeah. But yeah. So hopefully it's worth the wait. Another holdover from television is we have cliffhangers in every aspect of script writing. Every commercial break, every sh and without intentionally realizing it, all my chapters pretty much have cliffhangers, and all the books have cliffhangers, and I try to make them fully satisfying that you're not like, "Oh, wait, I still don't know the answer." It's like, "No, you know
Right.
the answer, but you also know the next question,"
Yes.
and hopefully you'll still be interested in finding out that answer 12 months from now.
Yes. I will. We all will.
I hope.
And it'll be another book, like where this book, when I started, it wasn't a book that I read a little and I put it down and then I did the dishes and I came back and read. It was one where it was just, nope, I'm just going to ignore the other things to keep going. And you're right, you do get this sense of satisfaction. And then the anticipation, I guess, for what's coming next. So I can wait. I can wait. We'll definitely be patient.
That's good.
So I mentioned earlier the Renegades of Middle Grade, and I wanted to bring it up here because I went down, the rabbit hole of the website of all of the amazing authors and the books and the resources that are there. And as someone who loves to read middle grade novels and who has listeners that are educators, librarians, parents trying to pair books to their own children, I'd love for you to talk about that and how a writing group like that matters to you and then ultimately ends up mattering to us as readers with the sheer amount of amazing books that group puts out.
It's first, a couple disclaimers. The website is usually woefully out of date. And that's because I do my websites, that websites, and write the books and tour for the books. And so sometimes, but it's still got a lot of good stuff on it. But what ended up happening was um uh, earlier, you have to wait. You have to wait a year for some books, not for Stu Gibbs. Stu has like 3 a year, and Gordon Gorman has 2 a year, and now I have 2 a year. But there's a lot of waiting, and readers want to read, right? So that was one thing that was always boiling in my mind. Another thing was just I have incredible friends who are amazing writers, and I think kids are fascinated when they find out that no, we're actually like friends who talk all the time and goof off all the time and have funny stories about each other. And I'm not just talking about, you know, a writer maybe you've never heard. These are all the writers you know. These are, and we are so all that's kind of formulated in my head. And you mentioned earlier, which I kind of cringed when you mentioned because it sounds bigger than it is. But I was nominated for a sports Emmy for best documentary. And so I went up to New York for this thing, and I met up with some of my friends, Karina Glazer, Elizabeth Eulberg, and Sarah Mlynowski. And we met up and we had dinner. And they're like, "Oh, you're in town for the Emmy? How did we not know that you were nominated for an Emmy?" And I'm like, "It's like, I'm not gonna go on social media and say, 'Look at me,' because we're not built that way."
Yeah.
And it kinda go to the idea, what would be neat is if there was a way that we could say, "Look at Sarah," or Sarah could say, "Look at James," and that kinda led to this idea of like, we have to figure out a way to take advantage is the wrong word. We have to figure out a way to share this friendship that we all have. And by all, I'm talking like groups of like 20, 30 people, with the idea that if you like a book that I've written, then you're gonna love any of the books written by these 29, 30 people,
Yeah.
and vice versa. And it was more just a way to kind of alert our fan bases, because we each have our own fan base probably, to other books they might like and hopefully expand that. Also at the time, hopefully get them to read some writers that they maybe hadn't heard of because they weren't as well known, and also as an excuse for us just to do stuff together. So every now and then we'll do like a book tasting where, like, for Valentine's Day, we'll do like 20 of us will talk about our upcoming books that year, and we'll just involve a bookstore and invite hundreds of librarians. I'm a really big fan of the idea of us connecting and extending that friendship with librarians and booksellers.
Mhm.
So for example, in Sherlock Society, the Sherlock Society in the book is a club that is held at a middle school library. And I thought, well, maybe we should make that real. And so I opened up a thing where now middle school libraries can join, and I'm creating things for them over the summer and close to release. I'll give them, and over 300 middle school libraries have joined the Sherlock Society now.
Wow.
And, so in the book, I open with you can still join. It's not like it was a closed thing, but in the book, I opened with a escape room at a library. So I've written an escape room that school librarians can use in their libraries. So it's like they're in the club, and this is not, a sales technique of like, oh, well, this, it's not advertising. It's not, if it helps sell books, I'm not upset with that. But really, the idea is any place that can break down the separation between the page and the classroom has just got to be good. And so if it's like, no, that's not just the thing you read about, you can do that. The one book that really impacted me as a kid, even though I wasn't a reader, was from the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Baisley Frankweiler. And I was always loved the fact that it took place at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I knew that I could go there and these fictional things I read about would be a little more real. And I think that's part of why my books use so many real places. And it's why I'm looking for ways to break that barrier down, because I just feel like a kid who truly is invested in the world of books has just such a higher trajectory of where life and happiness can be.
Yes. Yes. I actually have a page in my notebook that I just call my book bucket list of all the places I want to go or see or travel to because I have
You
read about them in a book and they have sparked something in me.
There you
Yes.
go. That's
I
great.
really
What
like
what
that.
what's a place in that list for you?
Right now it is Northern Michigan.
Really? What book was that?
Viola Shipman, aka Wade Rouse's books. A lot of his books are set there. And I've read multiple books that every time I think, why haven't I been there yet? Why haven't I been there yet? So that's my goal. Northern Michigan.
At the end of my TV career, as I'm moving into books, the people I worked with are like, James, you got this backwards, right? Books are dying technology and television and all this stuff. I'm like, I maybe have it backwards, but I'm willing to go on that. And literally, so City Spies came out on March the 10th, 2020, and March 13th, the world shut down because of COVID.
Mhm.
And television production everywhere shut down. And I had just made this transition into writing, and books were still books. And then we remembered, I think somewhere early in COVID, that, oh, wow, books take us places when we can't go there.
Yes.
And all of these people in their homes really renewed this love of books, of like, especially, kid books did great during COVID because it was a chance to go to Northern Michigan or on a spy mission to Russia, or, solving mysteries in Miami. And I just love that part of the transportation of it all. I
Yeah.
love that it can do that. That's great that you have that list. I all the time will come across, like, "Oh, that I remember reading about that. That's really here." Or, "What did they do different? And why did they do different?" And, "Oh, no, that's not different at all." Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, one day.
one day.
One day. Talking about that list in my notebook reminded me another piece that I loved in Sherlock Society was Grandpa, in order to prepare them for whatever mystery they're going to solve, he has them go into the research and they have their notebooks. And that was such a piece that I connected with because I notebook and write in that notebook daily. And so I loved that the notebook was that piece that kind of tied everything together. And so I'm wondering, do you notebook? Do you have a notebook?
I have some notebooks for notes. My very first writing gig, if you'll call it that, was when I was, um, in between 6th and 12th grade. The Jacksonville newspaper, the Florida Times-Union, had, decided for a summer they would have a kids-only written magazine that came out 3 times over the summer, and I got picked to write for that, and I wrote a ton for it, and we all got those reporter notebooks, that had the name of the paper on the front, and you flip it over. It's a vertical flip, not a side flip, and you just jot down little things, and I just loved those. And so I wanted that in, and I wanted, I wanted a combination of old school and technology in this book. I don't like relying on technology in books in part because it's gonna change anyway, but also I like the fundamental part. So grandpa really stresses that, hey, let's just write it in a book. One of the kids is constantly, you can write it in your phone. And every now and then her phone proves to be better than his notebook. And he reluctantly admits, okay, you're right. Because I don't think it's like Luddite thing where it's like, no technology, but it's like there's still room for notebooks. There's still room for scribbling and note taking. I'm less notebook and I'm more note card. And that's a TV thing
Mhm.
in television construction, when you make a TV show, the staff will generally get around and will throw out ideas, and you'll write them on note cards, and you tape the note cards to the wall, and you rearrange them to find kind of the plot. And I think that technique is I like being able to see all of the writing at once, which a notebook doesn't give me. And I can take a kitchen table and I can fill it with note cards, and I can visually look at an entire story, and that truly helps me.
Yeah. I can picture your table. I know Anne Braden, who we've had in the podcast,
Mhm.
she uses this kind of back stairwell section of her home, and there's sticky notes all over it as she's brainstorming. And I love seeing her social media feed with all the sticky notes comes out because that means
Right.
something really good is on the way.
Yes, yes, it is like that. And when I would do them on the floor, but then my dog would walk through and mess them up, and so I moved to the table. So, because I can't when you're on a TV show, you tape them to the wall because you don't care about the paint job. In my house, I can't hurt the paint job because I'm
Right.
responsible for it.
That matters.
Yes.
Well, I have had a wonderful time talking with you about Sherlock Society, about writing, about middle grade in general, and I imagine listeners have too. Can you tell us where they can find you online, social media? If they want to know more about you or find your books.
Sure, you can find me online, at jamesponti.com, and also at renegadesofmiddlegrade.com. You can find me on social media on I hate saying X instead of Twitter. On Twitter at James Ponti, and on Instagram at James Ponti Books. And I'm not the best at always getting back to people, which is just overwhelmed, not about intention. But I do try to connect a lot that way, and it's just it helps me so much to not just send books into a void. Like to hear back, oh, like even now in this conversation, you mentioned a couple things that you liked about Sherlock that I hadn't thought about. It's like, oh well, maybe I should go back to that in the next one. It just really helps to do that. And that's really one of the great things about the community of writing is my one fear about doing this job was that it can be pretty lonely sitting in a room writing, but it hasn't been lonely at all. In fact, I wish I had a little more alone time because there's just so much going on and there's other people and it's all great. But then you find you're behind on stuff. But yeah, no, connecting is wonderful. And on the I don't know if you can put a link somewhere here or not, but if on Instagram on my bio, there's a link tree, and on that is also the link where if you want to join the Sherlock Society for your school library, you can join that there as well.
Absolutely. I'll put links to both websites, the social media link and to the link tree in the show notes, along with links to the Sherlock Society and some of my favorite city spies too, so that readers can just click and get right.
Rama. That's great.
Thank you so much for spending this time with us. I truly appreciate it. I loved our conversation.
Thank you so much. It was great to meet you, and it is great to get to talk to your listeners.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And listeners, thank you for listening to another episode of Kidlit Love Podcast. I'll see you next week. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Kidlit Love Podcast. You'll find links to all the books, resources, and ideas mentioned in the show notes at alitlife.com. And if you want more, you might like to listen to my other podcast called Get Literate. It's a podcast that explores all things books and reading, notebooks and writing, and everything in between to build a life you love. One more thing. If you love what you listened to today, please take a moment to rate and review the podcast or take a screenshot of the episode and text it to a bookish friend. This helps the podcast grow and builds our bookish community of kid lit love. Thanks for listening.